Alright. Guys, remember, I can only see Twitch, so if you're trying to message me on something else that's not Twitch, well, it ain't gonna work. So, let me open Restream. By the way, sorry it always takes so long, it's just that my computer is always being a fuck, so sometimes I need to fix a few things before I can start one. What's my login information? Fuck, I forgot. Okay, good. I got it. Alright. So, I felt that given the recent results of the US Democratic primary, that it was, as a person who does some commentating on politics myself, to sort of not give a statement, but to sort of provide not guidance, but at least some sort of opinion or some place to center where you're at right now. Because I know that, well, most people that watch me are leftists, so I know that a lot of people are probably pretty disappointed by the apparent victory of Joe Biden. I thought that, I mean, like, speaking of that, I mean, barring a miracle of all miracles, Joe Biden will win this primary. I mean, Bernie Sanders has literally dropped out. Thought that people, I'm not an American, but I thought that people might want to hear my opinions as a person who is somewhat more to the north. There is a possibility, I must mention this beforehand, that, and I know a lot of people are kind of looking at this. You're even seeing it playing out in the betting odds on Real Care Politics. If you're the kind of person like me who looks at that quite often, I think beforehand, the person that a lot of people thought was going to replace Biden was Clinton. Now it's Andrew Cuomo. I assume because some people think he's doing a good job in New York, even though he isn't. All right. I mean, as far as I know, he's been using this as an opportunity to cut Medicare and stuff like that. But let's not get into that right now, because until that happens, I don't know how relevant that is. But I do think it says something that there are quite a significant number of people who are betting. I mean, the people in the betting markets, they're betting a lot of fucking money. Like millions and millions and millions of dollars. And they seem to think that there's a somewhat decent chance that Biden is in such a not good state of being that they're gonna have to replace him come the convention, which is not really a good position for us to be in, as the supposed resistance or the opposition towards the sort of neo-fascist, pro-fascist institutions that are currently running the U.S. government in the form of Trump and his cronies. But let's go back to Biden and this whole primary process to begin with, because at least for me, I think that this primary has sort of revealed something that I think quite a lot of us did not want to admit to ourselves, which is that winning as a even moderately leftist candidate as Bernie is, thanks for following by the way, even winning as a moderately leftist candidate as Bernie is, maybe near impossible, or somewhat close to that. Because not only do you have the corporate media working against you, and if you look at the polls, Democratic primary voters are far more trusting of the mainstream media and corporate media than the Republicans are. This especially applies, and I've definitely seen this in my life, to the older generation. They're very, very trusting of corporate media, and they are by far what we call prime voters, which are basically the people who are most likely to vote, and they are quite a substantial portion of the population, and they're the people who won Biden this election. If you look at the polling, Bernie not just slightly, overwhelmingly won among people 44 and younger. Biden overwhelmingly won with people 55 and over, and I really think that says something about the state of the American political system right now. Trump's got this easy. We're getting to that. Because, I mean, to a certain extent, I sort of alluded to it before that Biden is such a weak candidate that people whose job it is to bet money are not that the majority of them are betting on this, but quite a substantial portion are betting on the idea that there will be a replacement of Joe Biden with Andrew Cuomo, despite there not being any official hints of this. But the idea of Joe Biden sort of actually being the Democratic nominee and having to go up against Donald Trump is such a I don't want to say ludicrous, but such a harrowing prospect that well, we're seeing what we're seeing now. So yeah, this not only does Bernie have to face a lot of pushback from the media, but I think we probably would have seen this play out a bit differently had Keith Ellison had Keith Ellison become the chair of the DNC. He's not. That is Tom Perez. He sets the rules. And he was basically put in there by Obama. Because Keith Ellison was endorsed by Bernie Sanders. If I remember correctly, he was also endorsed by Chuck Schumer and many other people within the Democratic Party establishment. He was kind of set to lead it. But Obama, not a lot of people know this, seems to have a vendetta against the left, and he's very, very against any sort of leftist candidate winning, even a black leftist candidate like Keith Ellison. And I think that's because he knows that once the legacy of a leftist candidate becomes manifest, the comparisons that will inevitably be drawn between that policy set and what he did, which is basically nothing if not exacerbate the problem, that's not going to look too good for him. And he's quite very much enjoying his legacy as the golden boy of the Democratic Party right now, and he does not want that to change. Obama is very concerned about his legacy. So we have to deal with people like Obama. We have to deal with people like the media, and it's becoming more and more apparent that working with within the system of the Democratic Party is somewhat of a lost cause. Because I mean, like, we saw what happened, right? I mean, to refresh anyone who kind of missed that, Bernie was about to win the primary. Joe Biden was always set to win South Carolina. He did, by a good margin. And whoever was going to be the first person to win a state against Bernie Sanders, Obama decided, you know, we got to coalesce around this person if we want to keep the Democratic establishment alive, and that's what they did. That's how Joe Biden won this primary, by basically a bunch of backroom deals wherein all of the sort of establishment fell into line against Bernie, because there's anything that the Democratic establishment does not want, it is a leftist candidate. And let me be clear as to why that is. It's because the people who are sort of like running these institutions have a vested interest in not having Bernie Sanders win, and that is because, let's say that, like, I mean, they have such a vested interest against it that they're willing to run Joe Biden, a man who at least to me, very, very clearly has serious problems with his mental faculties. I've known people with dementia. I think a lot of us have known people with dementia, and I think that looking at Joe Biden, a lot of what we're seeing is eerily similar to what we're seeing with our grandparents or great grandparents, whatever it might be. And it's not good. It's actually quite sad in a lot of areas. And yeah, but they're even willing to go with him because let's say that Joe Biden loses. I mean, they want Joe Biden to win, of course, but let's say that he loses. I think, being honest, looking at the way that he's running this campaign, looking at the position that he's in now, quite frankly, and looking at the position that Trump's in, Trump being at his highest approval ratings of his presidency, and Biden, comparatively to Clinton, being at a much worse position now than she was at the same time. Considering that, it is, I think, barring a big shakeup, and we are seeing a big shakeup right now with the coronavirus, so a lot of things are subject to change here, but it doesn't look too good for Joe Biden, let's put it that way. So let's say that he loses. These people are gonna still have a job. That's the reality of it. There's a lot of money and a lot of influence and a lot of time and a lot of opportunities to be made in the sort of resistance movement. I'm not saying that they want to be in that position. I think to a certain extent they care about having power, but what that is not an existential threat to them. What is an existential threat is Bernie Sanders taking over the party, because we know that, well, you know, and I know, and he knows, and they definitely know that should he take over the party, they're going to lose their jobs, they're going to lose their livelihoods, and he's going to replace them all with his leftist sort of staff and whatever. He's not going to have the I don't know, the near attendants or whatever, because they're awful. They're the worst people ever, and nobody would ever want them around. Were not for the fact that these people, 99% of the time, were sort of born into a great deal of political influence, and that kind of thing that they have, in some ways, inherited, and in some ways, sort of gained over a significant portion of their lifetime, would immediately, let me do that snap again, immediately be erased by a Bernie Sanders presidency. And because of that, we've seen a lot of very, very disturbing things in this primary. We've seen what looks to me, at least, to be in Iowa some sort of cheating, or at the very least, there seems to have been a selective releasing of the vote tallies, not only in Iowa but in the subsequent states, because well, let's put it this way: they didn't take too long to release Joe Biden's sort of results, and that's because, well, I mean, like, I'm not sure about this, but I think it's because why we always saw when Bernie Sanders won, and not when Biden won, but always when Bernie Sanders won, these ridiculously long delays in the polling results. I think that's because, to a certain extent, that was deliberate. I'm not saying they're like stuffing the votes or anything, but it's really up to them to release the vote tallies whenever they deem it necessary. And I think that they likely were taking some creative liberties with the necessity and the timeliness of their ability to release that information, unfortunately. And I think that somewhat contributed that and many other things contributed to Bernie Sanders' loss. Uh, so those are a lot of things that Bernie Sanders had to go up against, and I'm not sure that any person, barring the most skilled and amazing politician, could be able to overcome that. Because I do think that Bernie Sanders is quite a lot more skilled a politician than, for example, George fucking Bush. Both of them, to be honest. Uh, but he needs to be quite more than that. He needs to be an excellent politician. Frankly, he is not. Uh, he's a good politician, sure, but he's not an Obama, and he's not a. Who else is a very good politician? Honestly, Trump's a pretty good politician. It's kind of fucked to say, but I mean, he's a fucking reality show host that fuck WWE dude. It's fucking Donald Trump. He's a fucking president. I still can't get over that. It's so fucking weird. Anyways, Americans so fucking weird. How can you like Donald Trump? Anyways, so because of that, I think we need to start questioning the viability of this whole running through the Democratic Party system thing. However, I will say that I've been historically, and I still am to a large extent, quite against that because I'm not convinced that within the American context that forming a third party, especially within the 21st century, is a viable option. Just because of the way that the political system is set up. I mean, it's not parliamentary. If it was parliamentary, then I would say we should have been doing this for a long time before that. But it's not. And going outside of that two-party system is possibly even more difficult because then you have sort of both of these gigantic political apparatuses working against you instead of just one. I don't know if that's overcomable either. And that's why I think later today we're going to be talking about direct action and kind of going outside of the normal electoral politics way of doing things. But I will try to encourage everyone to stick with electoral politics. I think that is still very important and it affects a lot of people's lives. Go to the ballot box. No matter what I say, go to the ballot box this election. Vote for your local sort of guys in your local elections. There are going to be a lot of referendums on things. You're going to want to vote on that too. That's very important. But with regards to the presidential primary, I think a lot of you are probably wondering what my opinion is on actually voting for Joe Biden. And the way things are looking right now, considering everything that has happened, and what Joe Biden's sort of position has been on sort of attracting the sort of Bernie Sanders route, which is even more aggressively hostile than Hillary Clinton's. I must say that I am, at this point, not for voting Joe Biden. In fact, I would say actively, I would encourage you not to vote for him and to vote for somebody else. I would say do not vote for Trump. Just because, well, we'll get into some of the sort of dynamics of this later, but Trump's a bad guy, and his presidency would undoubtedly be worse than Biden's. Now, I have no illusions about this. I know that either Biden or Trump is going to win, barring a miracle. But this does not mean that there's no value either in not voting or in voting for an alternative candidate, because I think there is, and we're about to get into that. So let's kind of first address some centrist talking points with regards to voting for Biden, because I've seen some of this recently. I've gotten into some Twitter arguments over this. For example, one of the arguments is, well, what about the courts? What about the courts? Not a lot of people know this. Well, the old guard's gonna know it. people are about the age of 40, 50, but a lot of people my age don't know this. Unless they've been they're kind of well read on the political history like I am. But Joe Biden was actually, I don't know if he was the head of the Senate Oversight, but he was, I don't know what his official title was, but he was essentially in charge of, or had a massive role in getting Clarence Thomas into, not only getting Clarence Thomas into the Supreme Court, but in fact stifling the testimony of Anita Hill with regards to her allegations against Clarence Thomas. Furthermore, we know that, for example, Obama thought that Merrick Garland, a person who I think, quite frankly, is a center-right judge, was a good idea for the Supreme Court. And I also know that Biden is significantly more conservative than Obama was. So, forgive me if I have very little confidence that there will be a significant difference in the courts under a Biden presidency. So I just don't buy that. I don't. Let's look at another argument. Kids in cages, isn't this your fucking white supremacy or fucking white privilege or something? I mean, well, not me. Well, to a certain extent me, but people like me, I should say. Many of my friends who are also sort of a similar opinion to me are not white. In fact, if you look at the polls, the majority of the people who have this sort of break the system mentality towards the Democratic primary are actually overwhelmingly people of color. So, I would argue, in fact, that it is the opposite, that to accept the system as it currently exists and to perpetuate it implicitly by participating in it is in itself an expression of white privilege. Because it shows that, well, not that it shows, but it is at least some sort of indication that under Biden presidency, things are not going to be that bad for you. Things might be bad for you under Trump presidency, but not going to be that bad for you under Biden presidency. The reality is that under both administrations, there will be a lot of violence, quite a significant amount of violence against people of color, against martial law. We know, for example, that Biden supported Obama's immigration policies. Obama, previously known as the deporter in chief, because I think he, if I remember correctly, had an unprecedented number of deportations throughout his presidency. His immigration policy was quite harsh. In fact, he, and I know a lot of people will kind of push back against me on this, but he was actually, well, not he, but the Obama administration was actually the one who put those kids in the cages. I don't have the picture right now, but there was a picture that was initially purported to be from the Trump administration. Don't get me wrong, the Trump administration definitely is putting kids into cages, but this particular picture actually happened to be taken under the Obama administration. Yeah. So we know that this is not something that was unique to the Trump administration. It's just something that was, one, a lot worse hidden, and two, I think ramped up quite a lot under Trump. And make no mistake, I think that a lot of the bad aspects of Biden will be exacerbated and sort of be like twofold under Trump. But we have to get, therefore, into why, considering if Biden is, as one might say, the lesser of two evils, why one would not vote for him. So in the American political system, as far as I know, there's not something that in other political systems might be referred to as a vote of no confidence. which is basically a fuck you vote. Basically, we don't like you, go fuck yourself vote. Um, it's usually done against the party leader. For example, this would be in the case Joe Biden. Uh, when the constituents think he is, they're not, they don't like him. Um, this doesn't particularly exist in the American political system. So the closest thing I think that really exists is abstaining from voting altogether. Uh, I think that the more losses from, because one of Bernie's sort of biggest weak points on the campaign trail was this whole electability argument. But I think that the more of these centrist candidates end up losing to Donald Trump is, or not to Donald Trump, but to the right wing in general, is the more ridiculous this electability argument is going to seem. And I think that there was actually improvement on the electability argument, because for a while, for I mean, in 2016, the electability argument was a lot stronger, I think, and had a lot more sway. In this case, while it did have a lot of sway, initially at least, Bernie was actually leading on the electability argument. But unfortunately, when the media did their whole thing after South Carolina, Bernie was not able to sort of maneuver fast enough to turn the narrative back in his tide on electability. But I think that gradually over time, I mean, people aren't that dumb. They can see patterns and they can see when they're being fooled. And if centrist candidates keep losing over and over, eventually there has to be some kind of change. And I know this because this is what happened in the early 90s. I mean, the rise of Bill Clinton was a very, very complicated sort of process, political process. But to a large extent, it was spurred on by the idea that the Democrats were constantly losing. And that shift to the right that Bill Clinton brought with the New Democrats is something that I think a lot of people wanted, because they wanted to finally win as the Democratic Party. While that dynamic may have been the case back then, coming off of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the death of the hippie movement, things like that, nowadays, with increase in economic devastation, a widening gap between the rich and the poor, this new coronavirus outbreak, and new economic collapse caused by the same problems as the 2008 financial collapse, with climate change accelerating not only diseases like the coronavirus, but various ecological disasters around the world that will eventually cause things like refugee crises and whatnot. I think the opinions of people are a lot different now than they were back then. I mean, back then, the narrative was, it was a lot easier to have that sort of Thomas Friedman or that Fukuyama end of the world narrative, because things were looking pretty good for neoliberal capitalism at that point. Not anymore. Not anymore. It's looking bad now. Another argument that's commonly used is, well, what about climate change? Again, I've seen. I mean, there was a Paris Climate Accords, sure, which would have done almost nothing. Sure. But besides that, and even besides that, because, well, I don't even need to say besides that, because frankly, Biden has not put out any sort of comprehensive climate policy that I think will make even the slightest difference in the global fight against climate change. Because here's the reality: tiny steps like the ones that Biden are proposing, they're not going to work. In fact, they're going to have almost no impact. Most of the emissions are put out by only a few companies. So these sort of small neoliberal adjustments to the economy, they're not going to work. We need drastic action to address climate change, and the sort of things that Biden wants to do are going to be ineffectual at best. At best. If anything, they'll be harmful at worst, because then people feel like they've done something when they haven't, and then at least people know now that things are getting worse. I think Sam Cedar made a point somewhat recently that, oh, well, the Democratic Party isn't going to learn a lesson. The Democratic Party doesn't learn lessons. Organizations like that don't. Because, as I brought up before, they have a vested interest in not learning that lesson, to be fair. The problem is that I don't give a fuck about the Democratic Party in terms of what kind of lessons they're going to learn. I care about convincing the American people. And while the Democratic Party may not learn a lesson because they have a vested interest in not learning that lesson, the American people do not have such vested interest. I believe that they are quite capable of learning that lesson. And perhaps we need to make them learn it. So let's take a look at this thing, because here's the thing. Let me kind of go back to 2016, because in 2016 I said vote Hillary, because at the time it seemed possible that changes to the Democratic Party could be made such that a leftist candidate could in the future become a viable option. Even Bernie Sanders. And we now see that is not the case. I also said that because, well, frankly, Hillary Clinton was just not as bad as Joe Biden. We'll get to that a bit later. But I think we're dealing with a sort of different situation with Joe Biden. And it's a sort of Al Gore to John Kerry situation. Neither of them are good, but John Kerry was quite a lot worse. This is a similar situation with Joe Biden, except that Joe Biden is fucking dying. So I want to have us take a look at, because I didn't initially sort of buy into this idea, because I think a lot of people who were on the sort of burn your bus camp were, to be honest, kind of just doing it not for any strategic reason with regards to the Democratic Party or voting patterns or anything like that, but were just mad that Bernie lost. And I frankly do not think that that's a smart reason for not voting. I don't. But so I initially thought, I'm gonna have to vote for Joe Biden. Michael Bloomberg was actually, I think I said this publicly, the only person I thought, like, I can't endorse this guy over Donald Trump. But then I watched this clip. This is back in the day by Lawrence O'Donnell. He's an MSNBC contributor, and I have almost no doubt that he's quite embarrassed by this clip kind of coming back to the surface now, because I'm sure that being an MSNBC contributor, he would not say the same thing now as he did then. But let's just say that I think in this instance, he was clearly being a lot more honest. He was a lot less constrained by the institutions that he was a part of and works for now. I think that this is not only an apt sort of analysis, but it is an analysis so strikingly acute and it just gets so to the point of what I'm talking about here that I mean, like, honestly, I can have said it better myself, but it really immediately flipped my opinion on the idea of voting for Joe Biden. So honestly, take a look at it. Oh, where's it? Here it is. Okay.
If you want to pull the party, the major party that is closest to the way you're thinking, to what you're thinking, you must show them that you're capable of not voting for them. If you don't show them you're capable of not voting for them, they don't have to listen to you. I promise you that. I worked within the Democratic Party. I didn't listen or have to listen to anything on the left while I was working in the Democratic Party because the left had nowhere to go. If you want to pull the party...
I mean, that's the reality. That's the fucking reality of it. That's the fucking reality. They have to do shit. We can say, oh, we want this, we want that. But if, at the end of the day, we say, oh, we have this and this demands, and then we say, oh, at the end of the day, we're still going to vote for whoever's the Democratic primary nominee, then what the fuck kind of position are we in? Because at that point, if I'm sort of a Democratic establishment goon, I look at the situation and I say, I have to do shit for you then. And I think that's what Joe Biden's analysis is. Because Joe Biden, we'll see this, has been going around saying he's going to veto Medicare for all. And I kind of pointed this out on Twitter. He didn't even have it in him to lie. This is despite the fact that Joe Biden lied about fucking meeting Mandela. Let's look at this. This is reported ironically by the Washington
Nelson
Post.
Mandela
Let's
walked
look
out
at
of
this.
prison and entered into discussions about apartheid. I had the great honor of meeting him. I had the great honor of being arrested with our UN ambassador at the streets of Soweto to get to see him on Robben's Island.
What the fuck?
I came back from South Africa trying to see Nelson Mandela and getting arrested for trying to see him on Robben's Island. He was in prison.
Okay, we don't need to watch the rest of this because he didn't fucking meet him like that. Okay, he didn't get arrested trying to meet Mandela, so he will lie about that. But he didn't even have it in him. He couldn't even fucking lie about Medicare for all. Why? 2 reasons. 1, the idea of him supporting Medicare for all was so fucking ridiculous that he probably said, you know what, I'm not even going to try to convince anyone on this. Secondly, his analysis was probably similar to what Lawrence O'Donnell was sort of putting forward there, which is he doesn't have to do shit for us because we're gonna, like, we have people telling us, shaming us morally, telling us that we have to vote for him. So why would he ever do anything for us if he knows that we're gonna vote for him anyway? Okay, the only way he's gonna do anything for us is if he's fucking scared of us. Is if he says, oh, well, I have to do something because otherwise the lefties are not gonna vote for me. You know? That's the reality of it. Because we're so scared of Donald Trump that if we're so scared of Donald Trump that we're gonna vote for him no matter what, then we're gonna always get people like Joe Biden, because a real leftist candidate can't make it through the Democratic Party, and Joe Biden has no reason, just like Hillary Clinton didn't have a reason. That's why she picked Tim Kaine as her vice president and made no concessions to the left, quite frankly. This is why. There's no reason to. Why? It's strategically, it's a ridiculous move to give concessions to people who are not even fighting you, because that's what we're doing. If we saying we'll vote for you no matter what, we're not fighting him. We're his allies at that point. And if we're his allies, he doesn't have to do shit for us. He's taking us for a ride. You understand? So this idea of voting blue no matter who and assuring the vote to the centrist candidate no matter what just ensures that they do not have to do anything to appease us. Let's look at the Tea Party, for example. Back in the day, I don't know how relevant they are now, but back in the day, there was a wing of the Republican Party called the Tea Party, from what's called the Freedom Caucus. There were a bunch of sort of like libertarian types, sort of ultra-right on various issues. And they had a lot of sway within the party. Why? Because they fought against the Republican establishment. They were against the Republican establishment. And they certainly weren't saying, oh, we'll vote for the Republican candidate no matter what. That's the reality. So at the end of the day, that spurred on a sort of like shift that I think eventually culminated with Trump and the Republican establishment, where they had to say, okay, if you don't do this, this, and this, most notably, sort of Limbaugh influenced things like immigration reform, but also in some cases things like trade reform. If we don't do these things, these guys are not going to vote for us, and we're going to lose. So we need to make some concessions to them. If we're going to have any power, this is how we wield it. This is how we wield it. By weaponizing our vote. By saying, we will not vote for you unless you give us something. Jesus Christ. He would veto! Maybe I need to explain this to people. You know what that means? It means that it's already gone through the House and the Senate. It's on his desk. Which means that all he has to do is sign it. So it is totally, like, whether or not he signs it is completely up to his sort of like ideological opposition or lack thereof to Medicare for all. And what he's saying here is that he is so ideologically opposed to Medicare for all that even if he had the opportunity to implement it without having to exert any effort whatsoever, he would still veto it. That's how ideologically opposed to the idea he is. And if he is that ideologically opposed to that idea, then he's ideologically opposed to everything that we hold dear, quite frankly. And I don't see why we should treat a person like that as an ally. I don't. So, yeah. Bye, Biden. Because I certainly am not going to be fucking endorsing you or saying good words about you or telling people to vote for you on my stream. I ain't going to do it. Because, frankly, you're my enemy. You and me, you and every person on the left are at deep ideological odds. And we need to start treating this like this is an actual war and not a fucking play fight. And not like a battle for show, because that's what we're treating it as now. That's what we're treating it as now. If we're saying we vote for you no matter what, we've relinquished all of our power then. It's gone. It's gone. No. Especially right now, during the coronavirus outbreak, this is the time for war. Because here's the reality. If Biden gets, and this is where I'll leave you guys on. If Biden gets the nomination, here's the reality. I think a lot of people are sort of looking very, very short term at the whole Biden versus Trump situation. I think this is one of the most important points. in that they're comparing the policy platforms right now of Biden and Trump, and they say, oh, well, Biden's better, so let's vote for him. But what about after then? Because how did we get Trump in the first place? We got it from the neoliberalism of Obama, the constant pushing for trade deals, the outsourcing. We got it from the rampant corruption within political system. Trump arose from a dissatisfaction with all that Obama and his legacy and neoliberal sort of reforms. All of that's how Trump got into power. So, while you may look short term at the idea of Biden versus Trump and say Biden might be better, what about whoever runs after Biden versus Trump 5.0, who is dead fucking fascist and is about to take over the country? What then? Because if you think that after Trump everything is going to go back to normal and we're going to have like fucking we running against George Bush or whatever the fuck, you're dead mistaken. I feel very sorry for you, and sorry for your intellectual state of mind if that's how you think this is going to play out, because that's not how it's going to play out. If Biden gets the nomination and institutes the same policies that got us Trump to begin with, we will see a monster unlike anything we've seen before. So yeah, that's where I'll end it. So let's move on to our talk with Friendly Neighborhood Anarchist. I hope that he's still kind of in the chat, and once I unmute him, he'll be able to talk, but let's see. Hello? Oh, hold on, let me unmute him. Hello?
Hello.
Okay, I'm done. Were you watching?
Yeah, I was watching.
How do you like it?
Pretty good. Hold on. Oh, man. Shane's lagging behind. Okay. Yeah, it works. Alright.
So now we're kind of moving on to sort of, because I alluded to this sort of earlier in the monologue, sort of what can we do in the intervening time in terms of direct action and praxis in our on a local level in our communities, and even possibly on a grander scale in terms of influencing electoral politics. Because direct action can be used for that as well, and this is how we got us as socialists, for example, got a lot of the reforms during the Great Depression. What would you say are like good options for sort of engaging in that action?
Well, I'd say it's very context based. What works in one area will not work in another, and it depends on a number of factors: the general political leaning of the area, your socioeconomic status, I guess that's sort of the two main things. What one is willing to do, and how many people you could actually get to do it. Because, like, the thing with electoralism is that it's essentially spectacle. No matter who you really vote for, we're still going to be in the same social panopticon of, controlling some form of capitalism, whether it be social democracy capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, or proto-fascistic capitalism. It's still ultimately part of the same social panopticon. Now there's, ways around that, of course, with direct action. You could organize stuff like food drives, educate people on things that can exist outside of the system, because one of the main things that sort of if you're sort of familiar with the work with postmodern philosophers like Foucault, he talks about like which is where I bring up the panopticon as well. He talks a lot about the disciplinary institutions within society that.
Oh, you're talking about fucking discipline and punish.
Yes, discipline and punish. Yep. And how essentially because in previous times, in like the feudal times, when they wanted to, maintain control, they would have spectacles of like public execution. But now that's not really necessary. Rather, instead, people tend to, with electoralism and stuff like that, people end up sort of acting as that disciplinary institution themselves, where we feel like we don't need to do anything because we can just wait for the next election cycle, or that politics is essentially it's a game, it's a show, which is why I think that Trump won more than anything, because he's a reality TV show host, and the entire basis of the electoral system is spectacle.
Oh, I'm convinced that the number one factor in terms of like who will win any sort of like race, whether that be local or national, is what's referred to as, I believe, the Q score. Basically, it's a measure of the favorability and the popularity of the person. I think that there's a very intricate relationship between the popularity and the sort of the not what's the word for this, the knownness, the how much people know about the person.
Yeah.
But I think that in many cases we perhaps underestimate how much just the famousness of the person might be overall be a contributing factor to that.
Which is why I'm pretty much solidly entirely against electoralism, rather than just against voting for Biden. But that's a different conversation.
I'm still of the opinion. I'm like with everything. I'm open to change, but I'm still of the opinion that I think ignoring electoralism does more harm than good, and I think that there's nothing wrong with engaging in both direct action and sort of like engaging on the electoral level.
I mean, I don't have a problem if people do both, but there's a very very good article I read a few months back by some indigenous anarchists, which explains why voting is fundamentally basically not a is not like a universal harm reduction. Even in voting for people like Bernie Sanders, and like just relying on that. I mean, for me, it's less of harm reduction, but I'm not gonna like stop you from voting.
I think that's what one of Bernie Sanders' great strengths was, though, is that one of the big messages of his campaign was that it doesn't end with me, and that he was like a movement candidate, right? In that the message of his campaign was basically like, if I get elected, like, don't feel that like it's over, because like we still have like a ton of fucking work to do, and we still have to engage.
Yeah.
In fact, we're gonna have to engage more than ever, because then we actually have a chance.
Yeah. The thing is, though, is that, like I talked about a minute ago, with that sort of internalized disciplinary mechanism and the spectacle of electoralism, like a number of people will be happy of just getting Bernie elected and having their single payer universal health care, and then just stop there, and not address the actual deeper issues, and that essentially just staves off collapse.
Yeah, not that.
But anyways, it's getting off track. In terms of direct action, there's a number of things that one can do, either individually or communitarily. For example, we do not necessarily have to participate within the general capitalistic economy due to the existence of, if you're familiar with the concept of the counter economy from the philosophy of agorism.
Well, I am, but just to because I'm sure that a lot of the audience won't, so it'd probably be good to sort of explain that. You'd probably be able to do a lot
so
better than I could.
the philosophy of agorism is basically a left-wing market anarchist ideology that was developed in the 60s, and one of the main parts of it is a form of praxis called counter economics, which is essentially the use of what was termed black and gray markets to there was originally four or five five markets that were described by Samuel Edward Konkin. The white market, the black market, the gray market, the black market, the red market, and the pink market. The bottom ones are not important here because agorism sort of pushes those to the side. But the gray market involves sort of like buying things without a permit using cash-based businesses, and sort of and like cryptocurrency, trying to avoid the general capitalistic economy in a semi-legalist way without, the necessary larger threat of physically stealing shit from a corporation. Since, like that's difficult for a lot of people and not exactly a reliable way of one, like making any long-term changes, and it also runs the risk of being caught a lot more easily.
What he's saying here is buy drugs. I'm just kidding.
Partly. That is part of what I am saying. That is technically a part of the counter economy, but essentially the point of it is to take away sort of capital and wealth from the white market, which is the general state capitalist economy. And that's a pretty easy individual form of praxis that people can do,
Mm-hmm.
Like buy something. You can even do some semi-white market things, like just buy something. If you have a co-op in your area, you can see if you can work for them or contribute to them or start buying from them more. Buy from like a workers' co-op. Buy things from like thrift stores more.
And I gotta emphasize this might not seem like a lot, but like doing this sort of thing on a sort of like not a global but a very large scale just have like a very massive impact in terms of
individual, and it has a impact on yourself, and also if you get enough people to do it, has a larger impact, because all of a sudden larger corporations are not getting the wealth or capital that they need to continue, and so they eventually start to buckle and collapse under their own weight.
The only thing I fear from that though is I don't know, because corporations aren't stupid, and I fear that I fear once that starts becoming a reality, that like how, for example, the police is going to be weaponized to sort of break that up is going to be quite terrifying.
Yeah. I'm not saying that this is a fit-all solution, or even like the whole solution. This is just a single part that you can use to sort of liberate yourself in the moment from capitalism, essentially, or at least the broader overarching system that we exist in now. And also, if enough people do it over time, then it starts to pull wealth away from the larger capitalistic system. But this isn't, like the end of that. There's other actions you can do, like forming mutual aid groups in case of disasters, especially with COVID right now. Mutual aid is and mutual aid societies and stuff like that are, I've seen like a sort of resurgence in a lot of them because people need supplies. Mm-hmm. And in current capitalism, the systems aren't there within a capitalistic market to control those, and so instead sort of more non-capitalistic or even anti-capitalistic forms have taken over in the form of like mutual aid societies, where it's like we're gonna help you and like deliver your groceries for you. We'll go get your food for you and shit. You don't have money? Okay, well then we'll cover this for you, and then later on, you can cover this stuff for us or whatever. That sort of thing.
I mean, sort of talking about this a lot on Twitter, but we're seeing now, and I think we're going to see especially as the months go by, this sort of like, and the economic crash becomes a lot more kind of apparent in people's minds, and the ramifications become more apparent, that the general strike is going to become more and more prominent to the point where it's going to be something that I think Occupy Wall Street, for example, would have only dreamed of becoming. But in terms of like sort of spurring that on, uh, for example, know that there's a lot to be done in terms of like putting out that information. That's why I've been sort of trying to do that on the various platforms that I'm part of. But in terms of engaging with the general strike and trying to make that more and more manifest, what do you think are some strategies in terms of like doing that? Because I assume that that you support the general strike.
Yeah, to an extent, yeah. I think that is a form of praxis. I don't think it's going to be a be all end all like a lot of syndicalists think with the broad like general strike, especially being more of an insurrectionary anarchist, which is another thing. But I don't know how explicit I can be with illegality. But yeah, so I actually have a number of friends who are involved with like the rent strike and the broader general strike, and a lot of their strategies seem to be appealing to people via sort of simplistic posters, as well as memes.
Mm-hmm.
Because we live in, like I mentioned earlier, the spectacle culture can work both ways, where you have something that's mimetic. It's repeated throughout the culture over and over until it becomes a sort of cultural norm. Which is why, like the general sort of 4chan type memes and stuff, especially with neo-Nazis, can be particularly dangerous because, they're memes, they're mimetic. They spread throughout the culture like a fucking cancer. And then the ideas that they present become normalized.
Honestly, I think I probably agree with that more than you probably think, because I think something probably even as simple as what I did on my Twitter recently, which is kind of like changing your status to kind of your name plus hashtag General Strike 2020 is kind of a very good thing, and like spreading these memes and spreading these ideas is very important, because I think that to a certain extent, just getting the idea out there of a general strike is, at this point, we can talk about how that would be in the future. It's unclear how that will manifest, but at this point, that is the most important thing, because I think the idea for a lot of people of even doing a general strike, because of the current situation that's going on right now, is sort of like not even something that they would consider, to be honest. Like, it's not something that would even come to mind. And I think that spreading those ideas and like making clear that like, yeah, that is something that you can do, and like spreading these ideas to the point where it becomes like a reality that like there are all of these strikes kind of going on across the country, and the more strikes there are, is the more like comfortable people are in engaging in more strikes, knowing that there is a sort of like nationwide solidarity, and I hope at least a global solidarity in that sort of thing.
Yeah. That also depends, especially given the nature of this particular crisis. Given the right sort of influence and push, it could be a global thing, but as it is now, I see it being more of I see it remaining within borders rather than being international. Just due to the way that things are structured as they are now, even if it is
But don't you think with a globalized economy though that like there is no sort of like various general strikes happening across the globe without there being a global, like without that necessarily becoming global, if you know what I mean? Because
I think
a lot of these companies are like international, multinational corporations. So
yeah, no, I mean that like a like there could be general strikes globally, but I'm just saying like it wouldn't be. I don't necessarily think that people in each country would be specifically supporting the ones in other countries
Oh, yeah.
explicitly, per se.
Oh yeah, I doubt that as well, but I don't know if, at least at this point, I think that in the future that's
At least
going
not
to become,
without like a push.
yeah, I think that in the future that would become more relevant, but at least at this point I don't know if that is particularly necessary, because all we need to sort of like break apart a lot of these capitalist structures is for these localized general strikes to happen, because in a globalized economy that like we can in a sense weaponize the globalization that has been sort of like implemented against a lot of these
It's
corporations.
sort of risky, but I mean, capital is pretty tenacious as a entity, and it tends to find ways to reform or regroup under a different name or form, regardless of how much one co-opts it. In fact, it ends up usually co-opting the thing that tries to co-opt it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of, without other more active and specifically anti-capitalist movements that came from the general strike, I wouldn't be surprised if the general strike ideas sort of just ended up being co-opted into a social democracy type of lens rather than a syndicalist or anarchist one.
I think the reality is that, I mean, if you're going to compare this to, for example, the Great Depression, I mean, right now we have a lot of people in the time on their hand with a lot of time on their hands, and a lot of time to kind of spread those ideas. And furthermore, we're facing right now in the U.S. 15% unemployment. I believe at that point it is worse than the Great Depression. If it ends up becoming worse than the Great Depression, I think that inevitably we will see what ended up happening in the Great Depression, in which like we went,
which is a rise
extremely
of
quick.
radicalism.
Yeah, we went extremely quickly from absolute fucking free market, no barriers whatsoever, to we're having a revolution right now. I think that like,
well, I mean, that's not the
if
only
it
thing that
becomes
happened.
as bad as it is looking, I think that in a certain sense it may become an inevitability.
Yeah, that's an optimistic look, but you have to look at what else was happening at the same time, because like at the same time, while there were communist and anarchist groups that were sort of rising and doing shit in the 30s, what ended up happening was someone more on a sort of sock them level being elected and creating changes and stuff that eventually sort of reterritorialized the entire system again back into the favor of capitalism.
Well, yeah, but that
also,
was
not to
because
mention,
FDR was an extremely unique individual in that he was a he was kind of like the only one who could kind of pull this off, in that he was a bourgeois capitalist fella who was one of the only people who was smart enough to realize like, yo, we actually, if we do not want to like all die in like a revolution, we have to do something right now. And I don't know if such an equivalent exists in the current
maybe not
timeline.
currently, but I mean the thing is that like, you know, the system sort of shapes people, and so like if the system wants to survive, there's going to be someone who is either already here or is going to be essentially sort of created in order to maintain that. But also, that's not even the main point. The main point that I was getting at was that even if one of those revolutions did happen, there wasn't just communists and anarchists. You have to remember at the same time, while there were like, when the Communist Party of the United States of America was pretty large, there was also like monarchist and neo-Nazi.
Undoubtedly.
And,
in fact, I think in many areas it's going to become far worse.
Yeah.
And I think that we might end up seeing the sort of like prophesied Ragnarok phase Ragnarok phase of the sort of like modern socialist theory, in which like there are a bunch of socialist revolutions and also a bunch of fascist revolutions, and then they all go to war.
Yeah, that's very much a possibility, although, eventually all of them fell apart because of essentially a weak form of social democracy, and in a time period where a bunch of forms of social democracy already do exist, and we've had a single social democracy candidate who's been relatively popular and only beaten out by the establishment and media bullshittery, then it's very possible that someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar or someone else who hasn't come up yet or could change, becoming a social democrat and
Well, it's probably not going to be
making
Ellen Omar.
making-
I think the
and making
likelihood
the
of
change.
Ellen Omar
being elected as a president. No, that's
very
not gonna
unlikely.
happen.
Yeah,
That's not gonna happen.
I mean, I have
I
strong
just
doubts about
use that as an
Ocasio-Cortez,
example.
much less fucking Ellen Omar.
Yeah, I don't see it happening. But I'm just using them as an example,
Mhm.
considering that Sanders and those two are the main social democrats in the Democratic Party, as far as I know.
But I think that we are probably going to
And-
see the rise of a lot of like actual genuine like
Oh yeah, for
real
sure.
real radicals going through the electoral route actually. Like people proposing
That's-
some like
that is
solutions
a
that are far more radical than Bernie swear.
Yeah, that's a possibility, especially with people like Vermin Supreme in the Libertarian Party.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know much about him, but like, dude's fucking awesome.
Oh, I actually don't.
Vermin Supreme is someone who was running for the Libertarian nomination,
Mm-hmm.
and he's the guy who wears like a fucking boot on his head all the time,
Never heard of him.
and he packs a lot of irony into his like actual genuine political positions.
Okay.
And he's essentially like, I think the closest thing that would describe him is somewhere in like a left-wing market anarchist range.
Okay.
Probably something like mutualism or anarchism without adjectives.
Okay.
His slogan, you know how like politicians have campaign slogans?
Yeah.
Yeah, his was you've done worse and you know it. Like vote for me, you've done worse and you know it.
True.
Yeah. It's sort of absurdist in a way in that sense too, you know? Like his shit is basically just premised on the absurdity of himself. Oh, and then having actual political positions lined in there. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I've seen a number of I've seen like pretty much every type of anarchist have some sort of critical support for the dude.
But I've definitely actually seen some sort of both local elections and even I think a couple of people running for Congress actually, if I remember correctly, who are like explicitly anti-capitalist. And not to say that Bernie Sanders is not explicitly anti-capitalist, but he's definitely on like he's the if he is anti-capitalist, he's the softest anti-capitalist you can get really.
Yeah. And you know, like I have some issues with that being a post-structuralist, and like I'm also an anarchist, like I mentioned with the social panopticon. If you know what that is, that's like a panopticon is essentially like the perfect prison system.
Yeah.
So you know, apply that to society, and that's basically where we're at. And it doesn't matter how like radical or leftist it gets, if it's coming through that electoral system, then I have concerns with maintaining that exact same panopticon, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I even have concerns about that with organized revolutionary movements, which is why I prefer the sort of strategy of social insurrection.
Oh, I think I definitely agree. I think this is actually kind of one of my main criticisms of Leninism was that I am very skeptical of the idea of this sort of like extremely centralized revolutionary movement.
Yeah. I really like the sort of proposed ideas by people like the autonomists. If we're talking about like specifically Marxist type revolutions and such, then I like the ideas of the autonomists as well as the situationists, although they are post-Marxist.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't heard of them, but
they're pretty cool. Have you heard of like Antonio Negri?
Antonio Negri? No, but his name sounds racist.
No, he's an Italian.
I know Jessica Negri. Remember that girl, Jessica Negri, from like 2012?
No.
She was like this blonde cosplayer with big tits, and fucking Philip DeFranco had her on his show all the time.
I don't remember that.
I don't know. It's probably only something I can remember because, like, back in the day, Philip DeFranco.
Yeah, I never really watched Philip DeFranco, so I don't know.
Yeah, Philip DeFranco is kind of just something I will get because, like, his style of doing things is so, like, structured that, like, for an autistic person, it's like just really soothing to, like, when you kind of just like expect everything that's coming, and then there are all these like really small changes that happen over the course of his kind of run. But like back in the day, he used to do a lot of like he used to feature a lot of like hot girls for some reason. I always thought that was kind of like the weirdest part of his show, and like, one of the main girls that he brought on was Jessica Negri.
Yeah. Have you heard of the book Empire?
I mean, like, I know books called Empire. It's probably not the one that you're thinking of, but
if you're familiar with, everyone's familiar with Zizek. I know that much. Zizek called Empire, which was co-written by Antonio Negri, like one of the most influential political texts, like since the Communist Manifesto. If to give you sort of a idea of the impact and influence that this shit has.
I'll check it out definitely. What's it about?
I have a link of it. Man, I don't actually know. I know that it's a piece of autonomous literature, and that's about it. It's on my reading list, and I'll tell you about it when I get to it, and I can send you a link.
All right.
And that's it.
Anyways, I think we're kind of rambling on for a bit. So we're about an hour and a half into this. So I think I'm gonna sign off now. I think we've kind of made the. Is there anything else you wanted to add to sort of like the idea of sort of taking general direct action in the wake of what we now know as the situation post primaries? Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Oh, yeah, there's one thing, which is that Bernie has technically not dropped out. What he has done is suspended his campaign.
Yeah, by the way, guys,
you
can still vote for Bernie.
Still vote for him.
Yeah, you can still vote for Bernie, and do that. It's actually very important, because even if he doesn't win, the reason he's staying on the ballots is because like, he needs a certain amount to be able to influence the policy platform. So it's actually extremely important. Perhaps I wouldn't say more important than ever, but it's still quite important that you still get out there and vote for Bernie, especially since the boomers aren't looking. They think they won.
Yeah, and that's like the whole point. That's how it's being portrayed, you know.
What is?
Like everything that I've read says that like he's just full on dropped out, when the case is that like he has just suspended his active campaign.
Well, it depends on who you're reading. I mean, I think that anyone who's not dishonest will point out that, because I think that's one of the main things that Bernie pointed out in his sort of like his suspension speeches. By the way, guys, I'm not actually I haven't dropped out. You can still vote for me. So I think that anyone who...
Do you really expect anyone to be really honest about it, though?
Hey, Philip DeFranco did it. Philip DeFranco mentioned that Bernie did not drop out, so... Alright,
that's fair, but, like, is that really mainstream?
At this
point, what I mean.
Philip DeFranco is a fucking... Dude, you don't... Dude, Philip DeFranco has a gigantic audience now. He's like, 7-8 million views? He's huge. Damn. I mean, not million views, million subscribers, and he gets... Hold on, let me go on Philip DeFranco's website right now. I mean, not website, his YouTube.
Yeah, I was actually unfamiliar with that.
Okay, so his last two videos got 445k and 784k. He has 6.41 million subscribers. He is possibly the biggest news person on the on YouTube. On YouTube, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with anyone else who's bigger than him, so.
Yeah, to be fair, the last time I heard about him was back in like 2016 or 2015, back when like Leafy is Here was a thing, man.
Yeah. I mean, like, he's definitely the kind of guy who goes under the radar just because he's like the least controversial person ever. Nobody has ever had anything bad to say about Philip DeFranco. He's like,
Yeah.
he's the most like, he doesn't offend anyone. He's just there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think we've kind of said all that we need to say. So you want to say bye to the audience, and I'll say bye. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. See ya.